Good evening, everyone. How is everyone doing? I hope everyone's doing fine. Welcome to Group 1's webinar. This presentation is an introduction to constructs and models. Specifically, this presentation will focus on the difference between models and frameworks. And we will also discuss about the nature of models. Before we start with the discussion, we would first have an activity. I would like to request everyone to open the Google document attached to the comment section of this post. When you open the document, you will see two columns. One is for models and the other column is for frameworks. Please write any ideas that you have about models and frameworks. We will give you 2 minutes to think and answer. Thank you and enjoy answering. Thank you for writing down your answers, teachers. We could go back to our answers after the discussion and check if our ideas were correct or not. So now, let us move on with our discussion. If you have questions or if you want to clarify something, please write your questions on the comment section. We will first discuss the difference between models and frameworks. In testing and assessing language proficiency, we encounter the terms model and framework. Often, these are used interchangeably in the context of measuring a learner's communicative ability. Thus, sometimes you get confused with these two terms. There is further confusion because the terms model and framework are used with a range of different meaning in a testing context. We would usually take these two terms as the same. But where does the difference lie? Before we proceed to the succeeding groups and discussions, it is important for us to know the difference between models and frameworks. According to Falker and Davidson, models are referred to as overarching and relatively abstract descriptions of what it means to be able to communicate. Constructs are considered as components of a model. Frameworks, on the other hand, refer to a selection of skills and abilities from a model that are relevant to a specific assessment context. To further understand the difference between models and frameworks, we have here other characteristics and definitions that could help. Models are descriptions of what it means to know or use a language. It may be abstract and it cannot be used directly for test design or for comparing the purpose or content of specific tests. Rather, they are sources from which we select elements for inclusion in frameworks. It means that models are the bigger picture. They are the encyclopedic definitions of what it means to know a language. That's why it may be abstract. It is impossible to test everything that a model contains in a single test because, again, it is just a description of what it means to know a language. It is like a general idea. So if a test producer claims to be able to do this, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of validity issues, for there is no specific competency or skills knowledge to be tested. Frameworks, on the other hand, are a selection of constructs, knowledge, skills, or abilities extracted from a model. So we derive or develop our frameworks from our models. Frameworks are intervening documents between a model and a test specification. Test specification is also called specs. These specs provide rationales and empirical evidence to link the constructs tested to the explicit purpose for which the test is designed. So we said earlier that constructs are components of a model. We develop our frameworks from a model, and from the framework, we develop our test specifications that will link the construct tested to the purpose why we designed the test. In other words, a model provides a general understanding of how language use and language learning occurs. A framework uses parts of a model and contextualizes them for the development of specific tests. The next slide will show a figure that will help you see and understand the connection of models to frameworks and specs. Taken together, models and frameworks help us determine test specifications and design the right types of tests to administer. The relationship between models and frameworks is organized into a hierarchy that starts from gaining a general understanding of the nature of language, which are the models, to the specific and measurable aspects of language use, which are the frameworks. As you can see in the figure, we have there the model, which is the known universe of constructs. And inside the model, we have various frameworks or assessment frameworks. These frameworks may or may not overlap from one another. Also, not all aspects of a model is relevant to a specific domain or context of language use, or may be untestable because of some constraints. So you can develop various frameworks from a single model as long as they are relevant to the specific domain or context of language use that you would like to test. From the frameworks, we can develop test specifications. It is impossible to write test items and tasks directly from a framework or model. That's why we need to have these test specifications or specs. Tests or assessments are usually built from these test specifications. They are the generative blueprints or plans for a specific test. Specs tells us the nuts and bolts of how to phrase the test items, how to structure the test layout, how to locate passages, and many more. Specs also tell us the rationale behind the various choices we make. So this figure shows the relationship or connection of models and frameworks to test specifications or specs. I hope you now have a clear understanding of the difference between models and frameworks. Again, if you have questions or if you want to clarify something, please write your questions on the comments section.
Let us now proceed to the next topic, which is the nature of models. McNamara 1996 argues that all models of language ability have three dimensions, constituted by statements about what it means to know a language, a model of knowledge, underlying factors relating to the ability to use language or a model of performance, how we understand specific instances of language use or actual language use. The first dimension is what Himes called knowledge, and the second dimension is what he called ability for use. The second dimension mentioned about the factors that could impact upon our ability to use language generally or in certain contexts. These factors could be individual factors such as how we feel, our general health, or personality factors. They are not related to language, but again, can impact upon our ability to use language generally or to certain contexts. The first two dimensions presented are what we consider as communicative competence or communicative language ability, the knowledge and the ability for use. And the last dimension is actual language use. McNamara notes that models help us to articulate the theoretical rationale for such inferences as we may draw from test scores to the abilities of an individual test. Earlier, we said that it is impossible to test everything that a model contains in a single test, because of course, a certain model contains a lot of competences, right? If a test producer claims to be able to do this, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of validity issues. When we use language, we can trace the meaning of the score to its meaning in a framework, which includes contextual features, and then to a model of communicative competence. This is a key part of what it means to consider the validity of the score meaning. Now I want us all to realize the importance of score meaning. Let us not disregard the next step after we have conducted an assessment or a test. We should interpret and analyze the scores of our learners, because once we understood why our learners scored like this, it will give us a certain light in terms of how we teach a language lesson and how we assess a certain language lesson. Now, what does it mean when we use models for creating tests or assessment tools? Since models describe a dimension of language use, they help us determine the kind of teaching approach we can use towards our learners and ultimately the kinds of assessment we want to administer. I believe that you are familiar of the different kinds of language teaching approaches, right? As we design and structure our assessment strategies, we need to make sure that these strategies are consistent with our teaching approaches and the objectives of the models we adapted. So, for example, if our goal is to improve our learners' capacity to interact using the target language in a variety of settings through the communicative language teaching approach, should our assessment focus more on the proper usage of tenses? What do you think? If your answer is yes, I want you to formulate a certain reason in your mind. And if your answer is no, please also formulate a certain reason and try to think of the more appropriate kind of assessment under this certain language teaching approach. And later on, if we still have time, we will try to talk about it. Moving on, I hope that at this certain point of time, although we are simply giving you the introduction, you are realizing the importance of the relationship of models, of the frameworks, and of our approaches in terms of our language teaching and our language assessment. I also hope that you are recalling the kinds of models and approaches that you are using when you are teaching a certain language or literature lesson in your classroom. Because my next question is this one. Are you familiar with assessment mismatch? A mismatch in assessment happens when we assess students without considering the expected outcomes we have set in the first place. For example, if we use CLT as our approach, It would be better if we let students role play or conduct interviews with each other, right? Because, of course, the goal of CLT is to assess how our learners use the language for interaction, for communication. It's not enough that we use specific test items, but we also need to make sure that these tests follow the blueprints we are using. Now I want you to reflect on these questions. Are your language assessments aligned with your language teaching approach? Are you aware of the model you are implementing in your classroom? If you are the competences that are entailed in that certain model being covered by your assessment? For example, you taught how to add the D and ED in the past forms of verbs through presenting the rules. How then did you assess your learners? Did you let them write a dialogue using the past tense of verbs primarily ending in D or ED? Did you ask them to write an essay using verbs that end in D or ED? Are you assessing your learners based on how you taught your language lesson? Or are you just assessing them for the sake of getting a result regardless if your assessment is aligned with your teaching approach or not? Are you guilty or not guilty of mismatch in assessment? I hope that you are not one of those language facilitators who are simply assessing their learners because it is required for the sake of having a result, for the sake of paperworks. If you are one of them, please press 1, and if you're not one of them, please press 2. That's the end of the discussion. I hope everything's clear. Before we end the presentation, let us again go back to the concepts we have learned through this summary. A model provides a general understanding of how language use and language learning occurs. Framework uses parts of a model and contextualizes them for the development of specific tests. Test specifications or specs are generative explanatory documents for the creation of test tasks. All models of language ability have 3 dimensions: knowledge, ability for use, and actual language use. Do you have some questions? Clarifications? Okay. Now, before we formally end our presentation, we have our final activity. Please proceed to our Google Classroom and check out the instructions for our final activity.
And that's the end of our report. Thank you for your active participation and good night.